We interrupt your regularly scheduled program for this very special edition of Podshow Radio. And now, here's Brent.
Welcome everyone to Podshow Radio. I'm Brent Bradley, and I'm glad you decided to drop by today. Recently, I did an interview with a broadcasting legend. This gentleman is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's permanent radio exhibit. He owns his own music media production company, and he's done some interviews with some bands that you may or may not have heard of. They're not really all that big, but they're just folks such as AC/DC, Boston, the Beatles, the Eagles, Grateful Dead, Leonard Skinner, Led Zeppelin, Tom Petty, Rolling Stones, REM, Van Halen. I could go on and on and on. He does a weekly show called In the Studio that is syndicated on radio stations coast to coast across the United States.
Welcome to In the Studio, now in our 20th consecutive year. I'm Redbeard with stories behind history's greatest rock and roll albums.
You're welcome. Guitar up. 1, 2, 3.
Today in the studio, it's the 30th anniversary of the Rolling Stones album that reclaimed their title of the world's greatest rock and roll band. Today in the studio, it's the 25th anniversary of the 8 million seller, the final and finest effort in the arresting musical legacy of the Police. Today in the studio, it's the 30th anniversary since Foreigner took a second shot from the glass of sudden success, only to experience. Today we're in the studio with the breakthrough third album by those Tres Hombres from Texas, ZZ Top.
Hello, this must be Redbeard.
Yes, it's Brent.
Hey, Redbeard, how's it going, my friend?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Great. How's life in the Dallas area?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's a little warm this time of year.
Now, you're out in Kaufman, Texas, right? You have a big farm out there, from what I understand, right?
Yeah. Your email says you have some family out this way?
Yeah, I sure do. I have a sister-in-law and a couple of nieces that are living out in Kaufman. The last time, yeah.
Small world, huh?
Yeah, the last time that I was out there, you know, I guess you still have this little small downtown area, right?
Oh yeah, sure. It's just a tiny little town.
So
just a little, pimple on the map.
So how did you end up in Kaufman?
Well, everybody's got to live somewhere, and my wife and I lived. You're from Dallas, is that true?
Born and bred.
Well, you know where White Rock Lake is.
That's where I grew up.
Well, my wife and I lived on the west side of White Rock Lake there for, 13 years. There on Kenwood, just before Kenwood ends and goes down there to Williamson Road, right by the lake.
Right.
And while the whole time I was on Q102, and my wife got a horse, a mare, and the mare had a foal, so we needed some place to keep the horse and a half, and I always wanted to have a little just a weekender in the country, just some place to go to on the weekends. So she and I promised ourselves. We said, okay, since we both worked, Monday through Friday in Dallas, we said let's just draw a circle around Dallas and make it so that we won't look for any place that's more than an hour drive from our front door. Well, you can't go west. I mean, it's all still populated.
Right.
And you can't really go north anymore because it's all populated now all the way up into Allen and everything. And so the only direction, and mind you, this was in '95, so this was like 13 years ago. The only direction that Dallas-Fort Worth hadn't grown out yet was southeast, like out 175.
Exactly.
Towards Cedar Creek Lake in that direction.
So do you go to the First Monday over in, what is it, Ben Wheeler?
Canton.
Canton, that's right.
We live right between Kaufman. I mean, we're right smack dab between Kaufman and Canton. So, I mean, Canton's right in my backyard. I buy my horse feed and my gasoline on the outskirts of Canton, and there's no Walmart or any kind of shopping of any kind in Kaufman. It's real backward. So you know, if I want to go to Tractor Supply or anything like that, get any farming materials, I drive to Canton. Yeah.
Wow. Well, now you were speaking of Q102. When I was growing up in probably around the late 70s through the 90s, the two stations that I always listened to were Q102 and KZEW, the Zoo.
Sure, of course.
And was there, I guess probably in every city, there's a lot of competition between a couple of different stations. Was there?
Actually, no. You were fortunate to live in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I'm not saying that because I was on one of the stations. I mean, I'm telling that because, I mean, I lived and worked on radio, before I came to Dallas.
Right.
And Dallas-Fort Worth was one of the great radio markets in the nation. And the radio in Dallas-Fort Worth was excellent long before I got here. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to be invited to come here and to be a part of the long history of Dallas-Fort Worth radio, because, I mean, it was famous. I mean, top 40 radio was basically invented here with Gordon McClendon.
Right, KLIF.
Sure. So, I mean, this, Dallas-Fort Worth has a long, illustrious radio history, and some of the greatest radio personalities and programmers have come through here. And not just, and I should add also some of the great technical innovations in radio broadcasting were made here too. And I'm still discovering, it seems, every time I think I know the history of Dallas-Fort Worth, my last foray on day-to-day radio, I was on the air for about not quite a year on KZPS with the Lone Star format, and while I was there, I found out that some of the great technical innovations with transmitters and improvements in that side of the business were invented and perfected in the 50s and 60s in Dallas-Fort Worth. So it's just been a radio broadcasting in America owes a lot to the contributions by a variety of people that have been based in Dallas-Fort Worth. So I mean, I'm just humbled to be a small, tiny little part of it over the last 15, 20 years.
So there wasn't really any kind of rivalry between you and the Zoo?
Of course there was. Absolutely.
I mean, Lavelle and Rhodey were in the morning, and I remember you over at Q102, and I think there was a DJ, Randy Davis was over there, right? At Q102?
He was on the Zoo.
Oh, he was on the Zoo. Okay.
He was on the Zoo in the evenings or at night, I think. He would have been there in the early 80s, I believe, and for a short time. And but see, the great thing about a professional rivalry of competition between two stations like that, the audience is the benefactor, because these two companies were doing everything they possibly could to win the ratings race. So they have to excel. They have to be creative, and they have to hustle, and so that makes great radio, and it raises the bar. It raises the bar of excellence not only for that station but for the competition. So it raises the quality for the entire market, you see. And, of course, the audience is the real winner, because then all the stations have to get better, and you just get great radio. And for a whole series of years, for a whole era. And so that's the wonderful thing about the free market thing, and that's the sad thing and the awful thing about the consolidation of radio and media today, is that a couple of companies decided that if they bought all the competition, that they would no longer have to compete. They would no longer have to excel. That they could go for a lowest common denominator thing, and all they'd have to do is run commercials, and the people would have to listen to them. And of course, the flaw in that is that nobody, when they were forming that business plan, nobody had the cojones to step up and say, "Excuse me, but did anybody ever think that the audience, might not listen at all to any of our stations, even if we own them all?" And nobody ever said that. And of course, that's what's happened, is that the audience saw that all of these stations, sound bad and predictable and boring and aren't entertaining, and so they left for all of the other entertainment options that are out there now, and it's leaving radio, archaic and ready to be put into a museum. And it's sad, because it doesn't have to be that way. It's been self-imposed, self-inflicted. It's just sad. So it shows you that the guy that founded and is the head of Intel, the Pentium, the processor people.
Right.
He said that when everybody in the room knows everything, nobody knows nothing.
That's definitely true.
And well, that's what happened with these people at Clear Channel at the highest level. If you talk to these arrogant SOBs, they will tell you that they know everything, and it's sad. It's just really sad, because nobody's listening to any other station, even though they own, even though they thought they could buy market share. My one little station, Q102, had more market share than all of the Clear Channel stations in Dallas-Fort Worth combined.
How did the album rock come about, as far as, playing the long versions and playing maybe a whole side of an album? They don't do that anymore, and I kind of miss that. Well,
it started in the very, very, very late 60s and early 70s with what we called the progressive FM format, and it was simply a reaction to the top 40 format of the day, which was on AM. There were those of us who wanted to hear our favorite bands, and these exciting new bands like Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles' White Album, not the top 40 Beatles, but the Beatles' White Album, and Sgt. Pepper and Crosby, Stills and Nash, and all these great new bands. But the top 40 radio wasn't playing any of this stuff. And I mean, there was just tons and tons and tons of these new exciting bands, Janis Joplin, all the bands, that played Monterey Pop Festival. None of them were getting played on top 40 radio. And occasionally, if one or two would sneak on. It would be, like you said, just, the 3-minute pop single, but none of the, none of the album cuts on these albums were making it on the top 40. And, the jocks talk like this and everything, and nobody talked like a real human being and everything like that. So, in a few of the largest cities in America, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, a couple of little FM radio stations that broadcast in stereo, which was a brand new thing, stereo.
Yes.
They had basically no listeners, no really revenue, and they had nothing to lose. So they let some of these college-age kids bring literally, I brought my record collection my albums in from home, and they'd let us go on in the evening and at night and play what we called freeform progressive music, which basically was you just played whatever you thought was good and whatever you thought was cool and whatever you thought was hip and that people ought to hear, ought to check out. And it was as free for, that's what we called it, free form. It was as wide open and loose as that. And the DJs talked just the way I'm talking to you now, just the way I talked to you, when you were here, I was on Q102. We just talked like real people. And it caught on. It caught on huge because you got to remember, demographically, all of us post-World War II baby boomers, we had this huge demographic. There was just tons and tons of people, our age in America, and they weren't being served. And so when they would find this radio station in stereo, which was, like I said, very unique back then, playing, this music. Well, and by the way, it was all word of mouth. Exactly like the internet is now, how they talk about viral,
right.
Viral videos or songs spreading virally. Well, back then we didn't have the internet or anything like that. You just had word of, but it was electric word of mouth. And people would find this station, and it took about 5 or 6 years for FM to equal parity with AM radio stations in America, which is that's like, in media terms, that's overnight. If you say that FM progressive radio started, let's say, for sake of argument, it started about 1970. Well, by 1976, the survey came out, by the NAB, that 50% of Americans were listening to FM by 1976. That was an enormous sea change, an enormous shift, because I'll tell you, in 1972, when I went on FM permanently in June of 1972, people didn't even know if they had an FM radio in their car or not. They couldn't even find the button. We had to give away what was called FM converters that plugged into your AM radio in your car, that converted your AM radio so it could pick up FM, and it was mono, FM mono. We gave them away over the FM radio to try to switch people over from AM to FM. I know people can't remember this, but trust me, people didn't even know how to find FM. Everything was on AM. Everything. Every music station, everything. People didn't even know what FM was. They didn't sell cars with FM radios. They didn't have FM radios in their home. It's unbelievable. And from 1970, what I'm describing, to 1976, it completely flipped to 50-50. And then by 1979, 3 years after that, 90% of Americans were listening to FM, and 10% of Americans were listening to AM.
It's kind of ironic now, because I think a lot of people don't know how to find AM on their radio dial now.
Oh, no question. And I'll tell you something. The only thing that even brought AM, even brought it from complete extinction, you won't believe this, but the thing that made AM at least viable in some of the biggest cities to this day was, are you ready for this? The Gulf War.
Really?
Yep. From 1979 until 1989, AM was completely a wasteland. There was nothing there. But in 1989, when the first President Bush started gearing up for war and stuff like that, the few stations that were still hanging in there went into like a war mode on talk radio on AM, and people started, because there weren't any FM talk stations in 1989, none. There just weren't any FM talk news talk stations in America, and people started seeking out news and information, because from like day to day and even hour to hour, I don't know if you remember this, but we were afraid we were going to go to war, and we hadn't gone to war since Vietnam in the middle 60s. And it was a real concern, and people couldn't. It's also what put CNN on the map. I don't know if you remember that, but the same thing that put CNN on the map, which was the invasion of the Desert Storm thing, actually put AM, breathed a whole new life into AM, and actually reinvigorated quite a few AM stations around the country, and they've hung in there ever since. They learned that that they did have a place in American broadcasting, and it was with news and information, and so it was the Gulf War that actually saved the few remaining AM stations.
How did you get your start in radio, Redbeard? I mean,
I just right place, right time. Small town, Midwest. They needed somebody to babysit an automation machine, and somebody who would work for $1. Back then, it was the minimum wage was $1.15 an hour, and they needed somebody who had an FCC license that would babysit an automated machine that was playing elevator music on FM. And I was a college-age kid that needed a job. And so while this thing cranked out this elevator music on FM, the AM station was a daytimer, and I had to be up there babysitting this machine at night. Well, the studios, since it was a daytimer in the wintertime, they'd sign that thing off. Up north, they'd sign that thing off like at 5:15. So I'm sitting up there from 5 o'clock until midnight, and by myself in a totally abandoned radio station with a machine playing elevator music on FM. So there's all these empty studios. Well, I was telling you, I was 18 years old. So I started bringing my Jimi Hendrix albums and Crosby, Stills and Nash albums and Beatle albums and stuff in from from home, and I would play them in an empty studio, while I was waiting to take the transmitter readings. Back then you had to take the transmitter readings every hour. So in between those transmitter readings, I'd amuse myself by playing albums. Well, after a while, I got kind of bold, and I thought, well, there's all these microphones in all these studios, so what the heck, I might as well pretend like I'm on the radio. So I started making tapes of myself, but I did, introducing, Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, but I did it in the manner in which I thought it should be done, rather than, the top 40 stuff of the day. I did it in a style of the style that you're familiar with, that I've always done, just one-on-one, telling a little background about who was in the band, and, a little history of who was in the band and who played on this guitar, who played on this cut. And, I even invented a little new music show. I was thinking about this the other night. I don't know why it crossed my mind. I had a new music show called All Along the Watchtower. And, I've had a new music show at every radio station I've ever worked at. And my first one was called All Along the Watchtower. I remember the general manager of the station, when I finally did go on the air, he asked me, he goes, All Along the Watchtower, well, what does that mean exactly? What does that mean? Is that like drug references or something? It's just a name. It's just Watchtower. It's like a play. It'd be looking out for new music. He thought I was trying to send out drug references over the radio or something. I'm like, gee, give me a break. He was the same guy, though, that banned the song by Jonathan Edwards called Sunshine. Sunshine, go. It was
right.
It was a big hit song back in '72, and someone had told him that sunshine was a street slang for LSD. So he kicked the song off. He banned the song, and I told him that is not what the song is about. It's a pop song, and he wouldn't listen. He took a hit song off the air because someone told him it was about LSD.
Wow.
So you can imagine I wasn't there for too much longer. But anyway, those were the times, man. Those were the times we were in, Those were the times.
So what was the first, really big radio station? You came from, what was it, Memphis before Dallas?
Yeah, I ran the number one radio station in Memphis, Tennessee, Rock 103. It was a fabulous station, very successful. We were number one for the 3 years that I was the program director there and the afternoon guy there. I was there for 5 years, but music director for 4 and program director for 3. And man, those were great years there, and so successful. And before that, I was at WCCC FM in Hartford.
That's where Stern was at too, right?
He was there after me. Yeah. Well, you know your stuff. and I was at KFMQ in Lincoln, Nebraska for about 6 months before that. So, but I guess you'd say my national, kind of my national reputation probably really took off when I got to Memphis in '78, and then certainly when I got to Dallas in the first of '84. And that's that really, things really took off, of course, when I got to Dallas, because Q102 was so successful, and it was just so successful, and I launched my nationally syndicated show in '88, and it's been on for 20 years, and of course, that gives you an international reputation, and then I've just been very blessed.
I used to love to listen to you do the interviews. That was some of my favorite things that you did.
You.
But I couldn't believe, I was looking up to see different artists that you've interviewed. And we could be here all night, but you've interviewed Stevie Ray Vaughan, you've interviewed ZZ Top, the Beatles, Ozzy, the Stones, Aerosmith, Fleetwood Mac, Metallica, just on and on.
Yeah, I had a guy out here today, was installing some DirecTV stuff, and he said, who all have you interviewed? And I said,
who haven't I interviewed?
Basically, I've interviewed everybody in rock and roll that's alive, and bless their hearts, even some that have passed now. But it's easier for me to tell you who I didn't get to. Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix passed away before I got in the business. They passed in '70, and I started in '71. But really, and I never interviewed Bob Dylan. I've yet to interview Bruce Springsteen, who's one of my all-time favorites, but I haven't given up on him. Dylan, I'm not even pursuing because he does it for money, and I've never offered money, and it's like he does it for money and for movies and for books and stuff like that if you pay him. And so I quite a long time ago I realized it's like, well, we'll just let Bob go because that's not really what I do. That's not really my motive. Springsteen, I'm still would I'd give my right arm to interview Bruce because I'm such a fan. And I've never interviewed Van Morrison because Van doesn't even talk to himself. No one's ever interviewed Van Morrison. He won't even talk to his record company president, and that guy signs his check. So, but that's it. I mean, that's my short list. I've talked to everybody else.
Who was your? I know it's kind of like asking, your favorite.
You're
child,
not going to ask me who my favorite was, are you?
No, I'm not going to say who was your favorite, but who was the one that once you finished the interview, you walked away and you thought, "Man, that was a damn good interview."
What you mean on their part? You mean they really,
Yeah, between the chemistry between the two.
Like you said, we'll be here all night. I mean, there's been so many. Brent, I must say, and this is not a compliment to me. This is, I'm just saying that really the vast majority usually go that way. I mean, I really, really love what I do. I'm a fan, you see. And so, I'm a fan. And so most of them I feel that way about. I mean, it's Kid Leo, who was a jock at MMS in Cleveland for so many years, he said, this is not my job. This is my pleasure. And I thought, I can't say that any better. I mean, that's so well said. So in other words, talking, I'm such a fan of musicians and music that talking to them about the creative process, don't get me wrong, I'm not a groupie. I'm not enamored of their fame. I got over that a long time ago. I'm fascinated by the creative process. I'm fascinated how somebody like Tom Petty can write something so simple as Free Fallin', and the whole world loves it. I mean, it's really simple. But, Buddy Holly's music was really simple. And lots of, Paul McCartney wrote once in Silly Love Songs, what in the world's wrong with Silly Love Songs? It's true, so I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by how we can go from the intricacies of Rush or the Mahavishnu Orchestra or something like that, and then turn around and hear Free Fallin', and how I can admire and love both. And that really, I can, I never get tired or bored with discussing the creative process with these people, because it just fascinates me. How they, where their muse comes from, where this stuff comes from. And I find that talking politics with little Stephen Van Zandt or Don Henley, I find them to be much more, or Jackson Brown, to be much better read, much better informed, and I find their conclusions to be much more incisive than many of our senators and congressmen. So it's not just the creative process, although usually, 80% of the time it will be. But some of these musicians, some of these performers are very sharp cookies, and they are engaging conversationalists on a lot of levels. You want to have. Ask me who I'd rather have over as a dinner guest: John McCain or Pete Townsend. John McCain, Hillary Clinton, or Robbie Robertson. Let me tell you something. Pete Townsend and Robbie Robertson and Don Henley and little Stephen Van Zandt could talk circles of foreign policy and world affairs around John McCain and Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, those musicians, some of them are just totally brilliant. I'm really proud of myself because I actually got my wife interested in the band, and I bought her the CD and the DVD, and she plays it all the time, and she's like, who is this band? And I'm like, they've been around forever, and she just listens to it over and over and over again. And it's the same thing with my daughters. They listen to some of this classic rock, and they think it's just so cool. It gives me a good feeling inside.
That's good. I'm like you, that I'm surprised, but pleasantly so, that people in the generations behind us are discovering and liking this music. I kind of expected it to be maybe an anachronism and out of time, and I'm gratified that the good stuff seems to be transcending time. And that's always the ultimate yardstick to whether something is truly art or not. Time is always the final decider on whether it's going to be an anachronism stuck in its time, and that makes it just a fad, or whether it's truly art. That's true of literature. It's true of fine art. It's true of any of the arts. And it seems like some of this stuff is going to make the cut, and that's very gratifying. Because when I was young, I was claiming, I was such a partisan, saying that this stuff is good, and of course it got no respect. It got no respect. And I said, I think this stuff, is the real deal. And of course it was just my opinion. I had then it hadn't had a chance to be tested by time, and so many older people were saying, oh, it all sounds alike, it's a bunch of crap, it's just noise, and it won't be around in 20, 30, 40 years. And it's very gratifying that some of this stuff is really holding up well.
You've been on the air, and you've also been a program director, which, as a matter of fact, that I believe it was back in 1992, you won Billboard's Music Director of the Year. Which one do you prefer? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is why, tell the listeners why there is program directors and why the DJs don't pick their own music anymore.
Well, the first part of your question, I really have a hard time separating programming from being an air personality. I really see them as one and the same. I guess it's because I've done both everywhere I've ever, worked. I've never been just a DJ. I've always the good Lord always blessed me with a good set of ears, and I've always had a sense, a knack for. I have broad taste in music, but I also at the same time I have kind of a every man, every woman's kind of a, I don't know if you call it blue collar or what you call it, but kind of I have, I guess, a mainstream kind of a taste. I mean, I have eclectic things that I like in my own time, but as far as media is concerned, as far as broadcasting is concerned, I seem to have a good feel for what the majority of Americans, at least the majority of Americans who claim they like rock and roll, rock music, I seem to have a good sense, a good feel for what the majority likes. And it all kind of comes down to just melody. A song with a hook, a memorable hook, and a melody that you can kind of hum or whistle in the shower. I mean, it really. I just think that the majority of people, they like strong songs. They like strong melodies, and I've always been very song-oriented. And so my programming sense doesn't get too highly scientific. I just try to keep my eyes open and my ears open, and I try to listen to what people tell me in everyday life. I try to keep my eyes open and my ears open around me and notice how people behave and how they consume music and how they consume radio, and just apply that to whatever particular radio station, or in the case of in the studio, radio program that I'm working on. And everybody has their opinion, and it's subjective. But nothing succeeds like success, Brent. And I'm in my 37th year of professional broadcasting, and in the studio is in its 20th year. And so after a while, you kind of think, I'm not going to question this sense or this knack, my gut. I must know a little, and like the Leonard Skinner song says, I know a little, and baby, I can guess the rest. So that's what I do. And so, like I said, I can't really separate programming from the performance that you hear me do, whether it's in daily radio or whether it's, on each week on In the Studio, because to me they're really the same. Do you remember when I told you that in the 1950s, 1960s, all of the big money-making popular radio stations were on AM?
Right.
And that a couple of these little FM upstarts, they let us come on around 1970 and bring our albums in from home.
Right.
And we could play anything we wanted. Well, those stations on AM that were popular and had all the listeners and were playing the top 40 music, those DJs were not picking their own songs. They had program directors, and the program directors picked every song and the order in which every song was played. So, saying that used to all the DJs played all the songs is not correct. What it was when the stakes get high and radio stations, whether they're on AM or FM or satellite, it doesn't matter. When the stakes get high and the dollars start rolling in and the DJs start getting big contracts to work there and the costs go up, management decides at that point, we better get a program director in here and make somebody accountable and get controls in here. We can't afford to have, all these wild, people going off on their own tangents, doing their own version of what the station should be. We need somebody to come in here and focus and tighten it down. And so we need a program director, and that way if something goes wrong, we can fire him and get another one in here. And I'm not kidding. That's what it is. When the money starts rolling in, instead of going, "Oh, this is great," they go, "Oh man, we have a lot to lose now. We better tighten it down and get one person so that if anything goes wrong, me, the general manager, won't get fired. We'll get the guy underneath me fired." And if you think I'm kidding, I'm not. That's how it goes. And it's not unique to radio. That's how it goes in business.
So the program director is the scapegoat in a sense, right?
The program director is responsible for everything that goes over the radio. If it works, he gets the praise. If it doesn't work, he gets his head cut off. And that's just the way it is in middle management in every endeavor, in every company in America. It's not unique to radio. That's the way it is. Middle management, they don't make much money. The top management makes all the money. Middle management gets all the blame.
But they're also the ones that try to reform an on-air personality to be what they want them to be, right? And not let them do what they want to do? That's awfully broad. I mean, there's some really good program directors who are excellent at what they do, and then there's some ones that, the old Peter principle. There's some ones that are promoted because they're yes men to management. They're not good leaders. They're not equipped, and they're cheap, and they're easily controlled by top management. They'll do 2 or 3 persons job for the price of one, and they're not good. They're not the right person for the job. But there's people like that in all. There's people like that in healthcare. There's people like that in making widgets. Okay, so look, it's not. Once again, these kinds of things are not unique to radio. Let's talk a little bit about satellite radio. I was tuning through. I've got XM and Sirius. I was tuning through, I believe, a couple of years ago, and I came across Deep Tracks, and I heard this voice, and it it was you, it was Redbeard, and I thought, oh, Jesus Christ, this is great. And I just love Deep Tracks.
Jesus Christ wasn't on Deep Tracks, but I was from day one. I was one of the original Dirty Dozen programmers that was hired by my good friend Lee Abrams and my dear friend Dave Logan, and it was a dream come true. I mean, we used to, back I told you when I brought my albums in from home at that first tiny little radio station in Ohio. I mean, it was only a fantasy to be able to turn a microphone on from my ranch here out in the boonies, and my antenna, my transmitter and antenna be 22,500 miles out in space, and have it bounce down to 48 states live.
It's awesome, isn't it?
Oh, it's I still can't. I did it for, well, trained for a year and then actually did it on the air for a year. So I was with them for 2 years, but on Deep Tracks from day one. I mean, I signed Deep Tracks on, and I still can't believe it. I mean, I did it, and it's still, talk about fantasy. And so, yes, I'm so proud to have been a pioneer. I mean, I'm as proud of that as anything I did in my entire almost 40-year career, was launching XM satellite radio. And what a thrill. What a thrill to broadcast live to 48 states.
And be able to sit in your own chair out on your ranch and do it.
The one I'm sitting in right now in my studio here at my ranch. I was one of the, like, 2 people, I think, maybe 3 people out of about 150 at XM that was not at their studios in Washington, D.C. I was able to do it by a T1 line from my ranch studio, and what a thrill.
Did you program the channel as well?
I was the first program director and the first afternoon host on Deep Tracks. I was.
I mean, it's, like I said, it's got to be just amazing, because it's kind of like going back to the old days of Q102, right?
Even before that, Deep Tracks was deeper and more progressive than Q102. It was very close to Q102, but even a little deeper. And because it had no commercials, it was even more pure, because it was all entertainment, all music, no commercials. So it was pure entertainment. I mean, it was just so cool. It was so cool. I mean, you just can't beat that. I mean, just no commercial interruptions, nothing but music. I mean, I played Tarkus by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Now, Q102 would have never played something like that. And, I mean, last time I played Tarkus by Emerson, Lake and Palmer was on my very first station I told you about in Ohio, bringing that album in from home. I had not played that since 1972, and here it was, 2001, and I'm playing Tarkus to 48 states live. I mean, stuff like that. I hadn't played, I played Even in the Quietest Moments by Supertramp and stuff like that. I mean, just fabulous, progressive album cuts that hadn't. Don't get me started. I'll start, rattling off songs, and now you'll make me want to go back on XM.
I wish you would.
Well,
I really wish you would.
Somebody was asking me about that the other night. Well, it was my friend Jeff, who runs the sound and the video at the American Airlines Center here, and I was trying to explain it to him. What it was it was the right job, but at the wrong time. If I was single and 25 and could live up in D.C. in an apartment stuff, it would have been the dream job. But what it was I didn't realize it until I did it, but two things are necessary for the total package for radio to be rewarding for me, and that is you got to have the audience feedback. You got to have the people that you're broadcasting to feedback to you and react to what you're programming. And I had no way of knowing how I was doing. I was broadcasting into this black hole because since I was out here on a remote location, and because we had just started and we're literally starting, see, it wasn't broadcasting. You got to remember, it wasn't broadcasting. It was subscription. So we were starting with 0 listeners. And we were building them literally one subscriber at a time each day. So I had no request line. I had no feedback. The only way I got feedback was I would get emails. And they were just, because we were starting day one, no listeners, 0, I would get a smattering of emails like the next day. From something I did today, I would get a smattering of emails the next day. And it was this delay, and it wasn't live. I wasn't talking to people. It was kind of impersonal, these emails and stuff. And so I wasn't getting the juice from the audience. And the other thing was, I was totally alone. I felt like the guy in 2001, the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. I was totally alone. I had no other DJs or programmers or anybody. Now up at XM, they had over 150 programmers and DJs, and I mean it was like a radio station on steroids. It was like wow, 15 radio stations all in one place. So it was like an overabundance of, they had 82 studios.
Wow.
So, it was like overkill on one hand, but at least you didn't lack for stimulation and camaraderie. I went from that to coming home to my own, studio out here in the middle of nowhere where you can hear, the grass grow. And I had nothing. I had absolutely nobody. I had no juice. I had no stimulation. I had no camaraderie. I had nothing. And so between no audience feedback and no camaraderie thing, it really wasn't fulfilling. It was, to be honest with you, it was lonely and wasn't very fulfilling. And so after a year, and then XM said they wanted more. They wanted more of this, they wanted more of that, and I was spending all this time on a computer. They wanted more computer programming, and I don't enjoy computer programming, and they wanted more of this and that. And there was a technical problem where I had to try to do the programming over the T1 line, and it would lock up, and then I would be screwed because it was the only link between me and them. And so I got frustrated. They got frustrated, and I finally said, "Hey, look, this isn't working. I think you are frustrated at your end." The one guy I was reporting to, and I said, "Look, you need somebody in-house, and you need somebody you can, kind of direct, and I'm not your guy, I'm used to being in charge, and you need somebody you need to." So I'm going to resign, and he was like, "Oh, no, he was like freaking out because I think he thought he'd get in trouble if be perceived as the guy who, lost Redbeard." And I'm like, "No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of that. You'll be fine. You'll see after 2 weeks, you get somebody in-house. You'll see this is the right thing. You'll be happier, and I know I'll be happier." And it was the right thing to do. But like I said, I have no regrets because it was one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. I'm so proud to have been a part of the startup of that thing. I think I know that I got him going, on the right foot. And I was just thrilled to have been allowed to be a part of it, because I mean, we made history, and I'm very proud to have been part of it.
You got to remember, you got thousands and thousands of people that grew up listening to you, and when just hearing your voice brought back so many memories.
Oh, well, you're so kind. Aren't you sweet? Well, that is very, very kind, and I can't tell you. I mean, that's so nice of you to say that. And I'll tell you, for people such as yourself, is why I came out of retirement last year in April of 2007 when KZPS, the classic rock station here, decided to try a real bold move with a format change. And they asked me to come out of retirement and do afternoons for them. So I did that for about 8 months, and then they got into trouble, and they had to abandon that. So they pulled the plug on that. But then I left at the end of January. But the people, there were so many people that said just what you said for the time that I was back on the air in Dallas-Fort Worth. I was overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed with the response and the reaction and the welcome back that I got. I was just overwhelmed, and just like, I mean, they said things like you just said, and I mean, I couldn't, I just thank the good Lord. I've been so blessed. I have the most wonderful listeners such as yourself, and I don't deserve them, but I got them, and I love each and every one of you. You've been you've just been so loyal and kind to me to let me be a little part of your lives over all these years, and so that's why I try to every time I go on, whether it's on a daily local show or whether it's within the studio, I really, really do try to entertain you with something special. And I know it's only an hour a week, but I still work really hard on In the Studio as if it's the first show I've ever done. And I'm really proud of In the Studio. I think it's as good now after 20 years. I'm definitely not phoning it in. I think In the Studio is as good as it's ever been in its 20-year history.
We'll get back with my interview with Redbeard in just a moment, but I want to let you know about a couple of our sponsors. Today's show is sponsored by eMusic. If you'd like to get 35 songs totally free just for trying out the service, go over to podshowradio.com, and at the bottom of the page, click on the eMusic banner. That way, you'll have 10 days to try out the service and find out if it's what you like. If not, all you have to do is cancel the service, and you get to keep the 35 songs for free. You have over 3.2 million songs to choose from. We're also sponsored by GoDaddy. If you need a domain name, go over to GoDaddy.com, and at checkout, use the code PSR1, PSR2, or PSR3. That'll get you a great discount over at GoDaddy.com. Now, back to the interview. How does XM know, or satellite radio in general, how do they know if a particular channel is working? They don't have the, what they call the books, coming out every few months. How do they know if something's working on satellite radio?
Well, to be honest with you, Brent, I don't know that that's that important to them. You got to remember, it's not based on ratings. It's based on ka-ching at the end of the day, at the end of the month. And they don't care if you listen. They just care if you subscribe. It's a whole different mindset. It's not based on listenership and estimated ratings and stuff like that. It's just like cable TV or satellite TV. They look at the whole package of services that they offer, the whole group of stations and formats that they offer as a package. And if you like the package overall, you're going to give them $10 or $12 at the end of the month. They don't have to worry and micromanage each individual station, because you're not going to drop. If you've got 120 or 150 stations, you're not going to drop the service because you didn't like that one song that came after that song on one of the, on station number 149, are you? The way it comes down with satellite radio is you'll subscribe to it based on, if you find one channel that's like knocks your sock off, that's eclectic, that you can't find anywhere else on any radio dial, and then if you find one more or two more after that that's gravy, you'll subscribe. Then you've got like 135 other channels, that's just like to boot. But people get it because of a half a dozen or less channels, and they go to them constantly. And most people never even get through the whole. I mean, it would take you a couple of years to listen to all of the channels. It would. I worked there for 2 years, and I never listened to all the channels, ever.
What's the chance of getting in the studio on as a weekly show on Deep Tracks?
I tried, and
it's a perfect fit.
We never could figure out a way to make it fly, because it has barter spots, national spots in it, and XM was always hung up with the spots, and they could never figure out a way to how to get around the spots. And now they ran spots on some of their channels, I know, but we could never quite figure out how to do it. I mean, they were very pro, making their own content, making it in-house. They didn't like to pick up content from outside, or at least this. Got to remember, it's been years since I worked there, and a lot of the original people, Lee Abrams, Dave Logan, people like that, and their original philosophies, they're all gone now. And they brought in a lot of terrestrial radio people, and their philosophies may have changed over the years. So I'm just saying that originally, Lee Abrams wanted them to create their own original programming in-house, and they had the talent, and they felt they had the ability to do it. They didn't really want to be taking things that were available on terrestrial radio and slapping them on XM. They didn't see, what would be the point. They wanted exclusive, unique content, and I agree with them on that. I certainly never argued with that. They should be doing that.
What would you say to somebody that wants to get into the radio business? I mean, the way that radio, there's no personalities, it seems like, anymore. What would you say to somebody that wants to become an on-air personality? Would you recommend it, or would you pretty much vote against it?
I would. Now, I am not a cynical person. I'm not a negative person. I'm an eternal optimist. But I'll tell you, as John Adams, second president of the United States, said, facts are stubborn things. And I must admit that it is not a good time for personalities in American broadcasting. There's not the training. Unfortunately, there hasn't been the training for about the last dozen years. Ever since consolidation and the laws changed in the mid to late 90s there, the large groups really stopped training broadcasters and stopped developing the training of on-air talent. So we have now a whole. There's this big null. There's a big void. A real dearth of trained talent. So we have a lot of untrained people, minimum wage, warm body, babysitting a bunch of automated computerized stations, and it's a shame. It's not a good time to try to get into that. I would encourage people that want to get into the entertainment business around the music business and entertainment. It seems to me like there seems to be more opportunities in maybe in the world of the internet, in the world of video, in the world of I don't know. Just seems to be more opportunities, possibly in some alternate media, and it seems to me that maybe radio is waning, and that now I'm not pronouncing radio dead and over in that area, but I'm saying for right now, until we see whether or not until we see the other shoe drop, until we see what's going to happen, whether some of these big consolidated companies are going to wake up, divest themselves, and let more, maybe smaller, independent operators get back in the game. I think that would be really healthy. You see, I think that the most training, the most personality, and everything seems to be coming from the smaller independent companies. Like, for instance, there's a company called Greater Media. They aren't a big company, but the few stations they do have are concentrated in big markets. They seem to still be doing great radio. And Clear Channel they're trying to get this sale done. It's been knocked off the track so many times. But when they sell the bottom 2/3 of their stations, there will be and then they go private. Maybe they'll refocus themselves as a radio company, and maybe we'll see some changes there. And maybe the stations they sell will fall into the hands of more radio-oriented companies.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the show, Redbeard, and I would encourage everybody out there that hasn't had the chance to hear Redbeard to go over to inthestudio.net and look and find out if his show is on one of your local stations. Is there any plans in the future to possibly, once the show has come out, put it out as a podcast as well, so people that don't have you in that in their market can listen to it as well?
Well, I never say never. That's for sure. The thing that'll probably happen first will be later this year. You'll be able to go to www.inthestudio.net and download your favorite interviews from the site.
Awesome. Now, there's one last thing that I'm going to ask you, and I don't know if anybody has ever asked you this or if you've even put it out on the air, but everybody knows you as Redbeard. The first question is who gave you that name? And the second question is, have you ever said what your real name is on the air?
Well, the first thing is it's just a legitimate nickname. I mean, it's not something that certainly that I would ever have called myself. But at that first radio station I was telling you about in Findlay, Ohio, the guy who first taught me how to be a DJ, his radio name was Dave Carlisle. He was a great top 40 DJ. And he used to be on in the afternoon, and I would come on after him in the evening. And he had been in the Army, and then he learned how to be a DJ in Armed Forces Radio. So back in 1971, in the little tiny town, Ohio town that I was in, I had, hair down to my shoulders and a red beard. And so for this Dave Carlisle guy who had, been in the Army and stuff, he was, clean cut, white walls around the ear, clean shaven and everything like that. And so I looked kind of like one of them there hippies. And so he was just fascinated with, the hippie look, the hippie movement back then. He thought we were pretty funny looking, pretty weird looking. I suppose we were. And so he would say, when he was doing his last break at the end of his show, he would never, ever call me by my real name. Never. He would always say, well, the kid with the red beard is coming on next. I'm Dave Carlisle. I'll talk to you tomorrow afternoon. Bye-bye now. And then he'd go into his last song. The next day, he'd be doing his last break. Just before I came on, he'd go, the red-bearded one is coming on next. I'm Dave Carlisle. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye now. He never, ever used my name. Well, this was on, remember I told you everything was on AM back then. Well, in June 1972, I talked to the general manager of the FM station that was playing the elevator music on a machine. Remember that?
Right.
How you started off our conversation some time ago? I convinced him to let me bring my albums in from home and let me start this, progressive rock format on the FM station at night. Well, I wanted to start clean and I wanted to start fresh, and I didn't want to have any connections whatsoever to Top 40 or the AM station or anything. I wanted to start fresh and new. So I thought, wow, I don't know if I want to use, my real name that I had been using on that AM station. And I thought, well, you know what? Everybody around here has been calling me Redbeard. That's not a bad handle. That's not a bad name for an air name. Why don't I just go by Redbeard? And you know what, Brent? It's the best decision I ever made.
So in other words, the real name does not get broadcast today, right?
No.
The ground.